Hello students, welcome to all of you to today's class. In the previous class we have read on the monkey's paw, and what we did discuss, it was all about the monkey's paw and how did Major Morris pay visit to Mr. and Mrs. White's house, and how Herbert was asking lots of questions regarding some miracles, some saint in India. So in the meantime what did happen, Major Morris did give a monkey's paw, and according to him, monkey's paw means what? Mankodara hato, mankoda panja. So here according to Major Morris, there is a saint man and he just spell some magic chant on that paw, and as a result 3 people can get 3 wishes. So in the meantime he did give the monkey's paw, but he also told that you should get rid of this monkey's paw because it has already created lots of trouble. But in the meantime, according to the desire of Herbert, Mr. White wished for the first time, that is for 200 pounds, and when he did wish, the monkey's paw twisted in his hand. Se mankoda pancha konla ta hathare emti twist kala. So he was stunned and he was little bit scared of it. Then Herbert is also speaking, means he is taunting his parents, means making fun with his parents that you can't get the money, and even when you do get the money, there will be some evil creature there sitting and they will watch that how you are getting your ill gotten money. जे तमे असत उपाय अर्जिथिया पैसा केमती तमे रखुच, केते गुडे मीन्स strange creature बसिक तुमको देखुथिबे. So all these things are being mentioned. So listen, actually this chapter is having 3 scene. Scene means what? When the place changes, the scene also will change. In scene, normally the surrounding is being mentioned and sometimes the climate is also mentioned. So look, page number 67 of your English book 2, scene number 2. Go through the book so that it would be easy for you to understand. Line by line, mu पढ़ी की बुझिला बेले तमनको बहुत सुविधा हबो बुझिया पाई. So the next afternoon, so that day over, they slept. Then the afternoon time came. The sun shines into the living room. Mr. and Mrs. White are drinking tea and sorting through the day's mail. Drinking tea. Drinking mane kono piba. But here tea, coffee is sipping. Okay. Through the day's mail, the paw lies on a shelf ignored. So it was afternoon time, means morning came, noon came, and it came afternoon. And what were Mr. and Mrs. White doing? They were taking the tea. In the meantime, they were sorting the day's mail. Se dinner mails. Kono so letter assi, kono parcel assi, semane check koruchandi. And the monkey's paw was on the shelf. Monkey's paw gote thakari thua hoichi, au samaste se katha bhuli jaichundi. Mrs. White, plenty of bills so far, but no check for 200 pounds. Then Mrs. White is speaking, lots of bills are there, but there is no check for 200 pounds. Both गुड़े bill अच्छी, किंतु 200 pound रो check बिल्कुल भी नहीं. I suppose Howard will have more of his funny remarks for you when he gets home from the factory. Then he is speaking that definitely Howard is going to make fun of you when he returns home from the factory. जेतेबेले हर्बर्ट फैक्ट्री रो रिटर्न आसीबो सेतेबेले से तुमको बहुत थट्टा मजा मीन्स ही विल मेक फन विथ यू, तुमको बहुत माने हम जो कुछ हस मजा करबा जन को जोक रे उड़े देबा. सो सेमती करबा हर्बर्ट. एंड Mr. White, I am sure he will, but the thing moved in my hand. I swear to that. Swear means what? Promise. Okay. So, but here Mr. White is speaking. Definitely he will do. Definitely Herbert मोर मजा कुड़ेबो. But से जिनसुड़ा से monkeys पड़ा मो हाथ रे बुलीला. के कहउचंदी? एडी Mr. White once again कहउचंदी. Mrs. White soothingly, you thought it did. Then so calm and quietly Mrs. White is speaking. हाँ, actually तमे भाभी थी बजे सेटा बुली छी बोली. Mr. White, it did. There was no thought about it. I had just what it is. Then Mr. White is speaking. No, I didn't think of it. It actually moved. Means listen, Mr. White is putting emphasis on his word that हाँ जेतेबेले से विश कले से monkey's paw टा तांग हाथ रे बुलीला घूरीला से monkey's paw. ओके टिके ट्विस्ट हैला. बट तांको कथा को ना ही हर्बर्ट ट्रस्ट कला ना ही तांको वाइफ ट्रस्ट कले. That's why again and again he is putting emphasis on it. Mrs. White, it looking past him out the window, and Mrs. White said, "I'm there." Looking past him means suppose now you are sitting in front of me. Suppose in my front there is a window, and what does happen? I'm looking like this. Okay, means तुम माने को न देखी कि मु झरका को देखिवा को looking past through the window को जाए. And there's somebody outside. Mrs. White is speaking. बाहर कहीं जने ठिया होइछंती. A man in a business suit, and that man is wearing a business costume. I have never seen him before and never ever I have seen him. केबे भी तांको देखी नहीं. He is acting very strange, as if he can't decide whether to open the gate or not. Here he comes up the path now. And that man is behaving strange because he is unable to decide either to come into the boundary, means come inside or not. Means a look at strange behavior, means he was in a hesitating mood. They have asibi, means he was in a puzzle, either to come or not to come. Who? That man. जे मिसेस व्हाइट कहते बाहर किए जन बिजनेस ड्रेस पिंधि बिजनेस अटायर रे ठिया होची एवं से लोक भीतर को आसबो कि नहीं से टिके डाउट बोधे करछि. हाँ, फाइनली ही केम. Finally that man is entering and there is a knock on the door and suddenly there was the knock on the door. Door re knock hela and Mrs. White goes to let the stranger in. Inside the stranger stands silently for a moment looking uncomfortable and Mrs. White went to open the door and the stranger entered and the stranger was standing uncomfortable. Means he was unable to think what to say. Stranger, I asked to come to see you. I come from Moen Meggins. Then the stranger is speaking. Actually I am from Moen Meggins. Mu actually Moen Meggins ro asichi. Mate patha jaichi apanko gharuku. Mrs. White, alarm. Suddenly Mrs. White got alarm. He was little bit what we say satarko hoy gale. Is anything wrong? किछि असुविधा है कि? Has something happened to Herbert? Herbert रो किछि है कि? It means Herbert, their only son, is working in Moen Meggins. What is it? What is it? And frantically she is asking, what happened? What happened? कौन है कौन? Herbert मोर ठीक अछि तो? Mr. White, now calm down. No point jumping to conclusion. अरे काहे व्यस्त हो जो? Who is asking? The husband is speaking. अरे काहे व्यस्त हो जो? Conclusion को कौन तमे चली आस्तो? Looking hopefully at the stranger, I am sure our visitor has not brought her any bad news. Then he is looking at the visitor, looking at that man and speaking that definitely this man, our visitor, has not brought any bad news for us. Who is speaking? Mr. White is speaking. It means Mr. White is quite hopeful regarding Herbert. Stranger, I am sorry. Then the stranger is speaking. I am sorry. Mu dukhita. Mrs. White, frantic. Is he hot? Mrs. White was worried. कौन है हर्बर्ट रो किछि क्षति अछि कि ताको आघात लागि छि कि stranger notes. Stranger is speaking is badly hurt but he is not in pain. किंतु ताको किछि भी जंत्रणा होने के कहउछंती here this man in the business suit is speaking. Mrs. White, oh thank goodness for that. Then Mrs. White is speaking, oh thank God. She breaks up, suddenly understanding, and stares at the stranger in growing horror. The stranger looks at the floor. Mrs. White turns to her husband and takes his hand. There is a long pause. Then Mrs. White is speaking when that man is speaking that he is badly hurt but he is not in any pain. It means what? Directly it is referring that Herbert is no more. Herbert is dead. But Mrs. White was unable to understand it. She is speaking, oh thank goodness. She paused because she was able to understand what this man meant to say. She breaks up, suddenly understanding, and suddenly she started crying. She was unable to control herself and stares at the stranger in growing horror. And horror in his eyes, she started looking at the stranger. The stranger looks at the floor. Mrs. White turns to her husband and takes his hand. There is a long pause. And whereas the stranger is looking like this. And Mrs. White hold the hand of her husband and there was a pause. Suddenly, samaste city silent hoy gale. And then, stranger, in a low voice, he was caught in the machinery. And what is the stranger speaking? He is caught in the machinery. Mane siye machine re padi gale. Ke kohchandi? The stranger is speaking. Mr. White, daze. Daze means a state of shock. Surprisingly, shockingly. What? Caught in the machinery is he squeezes. Squeezes means chipi dhariba. In the meantime, Mr. White कहते कौन मशीन रे पड़ीगला से आ तांग स्त्रींकर हाथ जोर भिड़ी धरले and stares blankly at the window, then turns to the stranger. एवं blankly means without any thought in his mind. तांग ब्रेन रे किछि थॉट भी नथिला. से बिना थॉट रे से झरका आडू चाहिए एवं तापरे तांग वाइफ को देखले. Mr. White, he is our only child, you know, it's hard. Then Mr. White is speaking, do you know? He is our only child. तुम जानिछो से हमर गोटिए ही पुओ. Stranger, clearing his throat, Listen, as this is an one-act play, so every physical activity will be mentioned. Just like in your alternative English, there is script writing, means mini play and conversation. In the same way, that script writing and conversation should have been written in the same way. Okay, you have to write down that one. That one also I will teach later. Then the stranger, sometimes you are doing, likewise the stranger is doing. The company wants me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss. Then the stranger is speaking. The company has sent me to show the sympathy with you because you have a great loss. तुमरे एत्ते बड़ क्षति रे कंपनी तार सहानुभूति देखाउछि. I hope you understand that I am just doing my job. Then the stranger is speaking. I hope you understand that I am doing my job. मु केवल मोर काम करूछि. And I am supposed to tell you that Mo and Meggins disclaim all responsibility. And apart from this, he is speaking that Mo and Meggins are not ready to take any responsibility. Mo and Meggins kichhi bhi daitwa means kichhi bhi, they are not responsible for the death of Herbert. They admit no liability, but in consideration of your son's work, they would like to give you a certain sum as compensation. ସେମାନେ କିଛି ଲାଇବିଲିଟି ତାଙ୍କର ନାହିଁ, କିଛି ରେସ୍ପନ୍ସିବିଲିଟି ନାହିଁ, ବଟ୍ ଯେହେତୁ ଆପଣଙ୍କର ପୁଅ ସେଠି କାମ କରୁଥିଲା ସେଥିପାଇଁ କିଛି ଗୋଟେ ଆମାଉଣ୍ଟର ମନି ସେମାନେ ଆପଣଙ୍କୁ ଦେବେ. Mr. White barely able to speak and Mr. White was unable to speak. A certain sum? How much? Like this he is speaking. Stranger, 200 pounds. Understood? So how much money was being paid by Mo and Meggins? 200 pounds. Mo and Meggins केवल 200 pound ही दबो कहा को Mr. and Mrs. White को because of the death of Herbert. Mrs. White screams. Mr. White holds out his hand and falls to the floor in a faint. Mrs. White चित्कार कले. Mr. White floor रे senseless की पड़ी गले. Okay. And what was the wish? Their first wish? 200 pounds. And what did Herbert say? I bet I will not see the money. I will. Surety is mentioned. Okay. So, Herbert had also spoken something negative. Herbert एमती कहबाकू से 200 pound wish करबाकू Herbert death होबाकू that money will come means they will get the money. But Herbert, as he had spoken previously, Herbert is not going to see the money anymore. Understood the point? That's why never ever speak negative in life. Got the point? So, because of the death of Herbert, they were able to get 200 pounds from Mo and Meggins. So, with this, your scene 2 is over. In the next class, we are going to discuss scene 3. So, till that time, have a nice time. Be happy always.